2 weeks of negotiations and years of anticipation came to a disappointing end at the climate summit in Copenhagen. World leaders entered the talks looking for a legally binding treaty. Today, they returned to their home countries with only a framework of a deal and a lot of details still to be worked out. Our Stuart Greer was at the conference and has more on the letdown and the frustration.
After an all-night session, the UN climate talks finally came to their messy and confused conclusion.
The Conference of the Parties decides to take note of the Copenhagen Accord. It is so decided.
Exhausted delegates acknowledged the last-minute side deal brokered yesterday by President Obama, but failed to formally endorse the agreement over objections of poorer countries.
The architecture of this deal is extraordinarily flawed. What has happened today confirms that a deal will be superimposed by the United States.
The so-called Copenhagen Accord agrees to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. It promises $100 billion a year by 2020 for poorer countries to help them cope with climate change. But it contains no hard targets for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. That's been put off until next month. Hailed as a first step, the goal now is to give this vague commitment some detail and teeth so other countries can eventually sign on.
We need to turn this agreement into a legally binding treaty. I will work with world leaders over the coming month to make this happen.
This is not what most developing nations and environmentalists were looking for.
They had promised to deliver a fair, ambitious and legally binding agreement, and they have nothing.
And today there was anger at Canada's lack of input at the summit. Ottawa has pegged its climate policy to the U.S.'s, a sign for these activists that the Harper government isn't taking the issue seriously.
We did not get a deal done in Copenhagen like we should have. We were obstructionists.
Back in Copenhagen, the cleanup of this mega conference is underway as some 15,000 delegates head home. For a moment, they believed they held the fate of the world in their hands, but after 2 weeks of frustration, the work of drafting a climate deal has only been swept aside for another time. Stuart Greer, Global News, London.
Well, joining us now is Environment Minister Jim Prentice. Minister, this is a framework only, so does it mean any concrete changes for Canada?
Well, this is an important agreement. It's an excellent agreement for Canada, and it's an excellent agreement for the environment. Its importance to Canada really is the following. I mean, we've essentially been able to achieve all of Canada's negotiating objectives in the Copenhagen Accord. Firstly, this is an agreement that will require the United States, Brazil, China, India, the emerging economies, to all reduce their emissions. That was the problem with Kyoto, was that they didn't have any obligations to reduce their carbon. And secondly, it has the Canadian objective of minus 20% by 2020 from a 2006 year. And thirdly, what it achieves is allows us to harmonize with the United States so that we can do this on a continental basis.
Still, a lot of people think Canada didn't come across well at this conference. One group even gave us the Colossal Fossil Award for poor performance on climate change. So why didn't we take a greater leadership role?
Well, Canada did have a leadership role on these issues throughout the last year. You know, there's a saying in life that you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And I don't think we've ever had Canadian negotiators at a tougher international forum, in tougher negotiations. And so I'm proud of the work they did.
How about influence? How much did Canada really have in fine-tuning the details of this accord?
At the end of the day, in the final analysis, the issue that remained was between really the United States and China. These are the two countries that are responsible almost for 50% of the world's carbon emissions. Neither of them had any requirements under Kyoto. And so it's not surprising that at the end of the day, we needed the President of the United States, the Premier of China, really in a room, eyeball to eyeball, working out that one last issue. And so Canada was a constructive player throughout the process, and we're proud of what's been achieved.
All right, thanks for joining us today, Minister Jim Prentice in Ottawa.